Hey, thank you so much. Oh, God, it is my incredible honor to be able to introduce to you today Jason Rhodes, who is my faculty academic advisor through my doctoral program, which is how I know him, but I am incredibly lucky to have this person as my advisor. And I hope you'll see why. But he is a core faculty member at Antioch University, New England, and has been for 9 years. He focuses on systems and participatory processes, and his research focuses on community-based participatory action research, which was a key component of our conversations last month, and it feeds in really nicely. So we are going to have an open kind of question and answer portion after his presentation, and we'll be yeah, so I'm going to let Jason take it from there. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Nicole. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. I am so excited to have the chance to engage with you all as a group, because you're focusing on something that's so dear to my heart and has occupied so much of my time and thinking in terms of the mix of community-based action research and climate change adaptation. And so I could tell I got a chance to see your three questions you're pondering today, and they were such thoughtful questions. I'm excited to learn from all of you as we dive into those. I have a couple of slides, forgive me, but I'll bring them up just to keep myself on track. Can folks see those? Okay, and you can hear me okay?
Yes.
All right, this is like maybe 12 minutes or so, so it shouldn't eat up too much time. But I have a couple case study examples of community-based action research that involved older adults and climate change that I thought might be helpful to bring forward. And I want to highlight at the outset that I'm in the fortunate position of getting to share with you about these projects, but there was such broad collaboration and so many people who put in so much time and effort. So I want to recognize that at the outset. I also want to say that, you know, I was thinking about your three questions, and I have some reflections to bring forward that, you know, represent what emerged from these processes and insights that different folks gathered. But in no way do I mean them to be definitive. They're just some insights we came to that I want to put out for the group to consider. And I also recognize the experience and expertise that's in the room. So as I mentioned, I'm really excited to learn from everybody as well. So let me just make sure I'm not missing anything in the chat. Okay, great. Feel free to interrupt me too if questions come up as we go along. But I have two case study examples. I want to share a little bit about the structure so you have a sense of how we approached it, and then some reflections on those key questions that I saw. So there were two projects. The first one was in Bridgeport, Connecticut. That's the map on the left. It was called Climate Resilient Seniors. And then a few years later followed it up with a project in Hartford, Vermont. So that's the dot on the right-hand side, a little less than halfway up in Vermont. And the goals of these projects were to center older adults in a participatory adaptation planning process, and through that to increase both the local level understanding of older adult vulnerability, also current adaptive strategies and resilience of older adults, as well as their preferred adaptation strategies, hopefully boosting our general understanding as well. And then perhaps most importantly, to generate tangible outcomes to enhance resilience for older adults in those communities. This is a table from my dissertation, which is where the first project kind of came out of, and I don't expect you or even want you to read through it, but the research process I used is on the left-hand side, and the reason I want to share it with you is because how I got there was by overlaying a community-based action research approach, which is this middle column based on a book by Stringer, with a climate change adaptation planning model. And I think community-based action research and climate change adaptation planning overlay each other really well. They have a sympathetic kind of structure and sequence of events. So I want to talk through that in the context of the case studies, because I think it'll have more relevance. And I'll talk through it in the context of the Bridgeport example, because it's slightly more involved, but there's some distinctions between the two and some nuances we could talk about. So this adaptation planning process started with some initial kind of planning meetings before the official project got underway, and involved in that planning process were a group of older adults that were recruited by the Bridgeport Department on Aging in the community with an eye toward bringing in kind of a diverse representation of the older adult community there. So we had 12 older adults that were really the core planning team. We also had staff from the Department on Aging. I was there as kind of the climate adaptation researcher. And then we were also fortunate to have other folks from city staff, including the Office of Emergency Management and Homeland Security and the Office of Sustainability. So in these few initial planning meetings, we tried to make sure we all had a pretty good understanding of the initial context, establishing goals, what would be meaningful and impactful for this project to do, and how could it be most beneficial, and then thought through designing the structure of the process so that it would be accessible and inclusive and help achieve our goals, and what kind of outreach would get a diverse representation of older adults to be able to join us. So the older adult participants at this stage were really the most were in the driver's seat, and their voices were the most important in terms of figuring this out. And so what we came to were to have a series of workshops that would be held at the senior center. We landed there because it was a central location. It had good public transportation. It was an area that older adults would feel comfortable coming to, and they could pair it with other activities they might be doing there. So we landed on the senior center. We promoted it, though, through a variety of locations. There were 3 senior centers in Bridgeport that were connected to different groups within the older adult community, kind of different neighborhood demographics. And so we worked with each of those senior centers and then some other partners to conduct outreach. We were able to pair the meetings with lunch. So we would have our workshop and then we'd have lunch right after as just a modest compensation for folks' time. We had Spanish translators at the meetings, and then all of our materials were in English and Spanish. We also built in, as I'll talk about, multiple means of engagement throughout the process. So there were these workshops where we had large group discussions and small group discussions. We had opportunities for folks to leave note cards that we could pick up. We had a survey that we built, and so folks who couldn't come to the meetings could still contribute. And then we had personal support, especially at the meetings and with the survey. So if folks needed any additional clarification or assistance working through the material, we could offer that. So this is kind of the overall structure. The way that broke down is our first meeting, we focused on current climate impacts. And so we were looking at extreme heat, air pollution, and flooding and storms. And we started with how those impact folks now. So we got into small group discussions and really tried to center everyone's lived experience. So how are you impacted by a day that's really hot right now? What's that like for you? And then what are the ramifications of that? We also didn't just look at a kind of deficit-based approach. We looked at how are you adapting? What are the skills, the resources that you're bringing to helping you cope with these now? What are the insights that you have? And we wanted to have those in place for multiple reasons. One, to acknowledge that strength and wisdom that the older adult community was bringing, but to have those to come back to in the adaptation portion as assets and strengths to draw on. The second meeting, we came back and we looked at if this is the picture of where we're at now, okay, here's where climate projections are headed. What's that going to mean if the amount of days that are over 90 degrees goes from this number to this number, or the amount of heat waves, or if we're looking at flooding in these neighborhoods to this degree? So it wasn't heavy on the data, but it was just enough to give a sense of where things might be headed, and then bring it again back to their experience and their priorities. What would this mean for you? So after we went through these 2 meetings, we have a pretty good sense of the landscape of current climate vulnerabilities and what climate change might mean. And we took up the question of what else do we need to know to launch into adaptation planning? And sorry, I'll go back a second. We had 55 older adults who are coming to these first 2 planning meetings. And so in discussion, where we landed was they felt it would be helpful to have a survey so we could get it out to folks who weren't able to come to our meetings. We could get a broader voice representing the older adult community in Bridgeport. And it'd be great if that could help us prioritize what are the biggest concerns people have that they want to make sure climate change adaptation addresses. So we designed a survey based on what came out of those first couple of meetings. It was about 33 Likert scale questions to rank a level of concern on 1 to 5, and some open-ended questions too. And the older adults also came up with the distribution approach to try to get a really diverse cross-section of older adults, including ones who might be most vulnerable. So based on their recommendations, we worked with the local hospital, a number of churches, the local YMCA, the senior centers, local radio and TV, and we had Meals on Wheels bring it to folks' houses as well and work with folks one-on-one in terms of filling out the survey. So we got 154 responses, and we were tracking demographic data as all of this too, so we'd know if we were missing certain groups that we wanted to hear from. And it gave us a nuanced picture of what those concerns were. We came back together for 2 final meetings. This whole thing took us about a year. And so in the third meeting, we looked at that and we said, given these priorities that have been identified, what are the goals we want to set for adaptation planning, right? What is the impact we want our adaptation planning to have on the community and have on older adults? And then what are the specific strategies that can get us there? We came back in a 4th meeting to finalize those strategies. We prioritized which ones we wanted to see try to move on first. And then it was fortunate we were also able to start the implementation right away. So one of the suggestions that the older adults came up with was to have emergency preparedness trainings specifically for older adults. And they came up with a list of here's what we would want to see that would be most beneficial for older adults to cover. And here's how to get older adults to come. The Office of Emergency Management and Homeland Security, one of their head folks came to all our meetings, which was just so generous and brilliant. And in that 3rd meeting, when this idea came up, he said, well, we could do this. We're already trying to do trainings, and this gives us information we need to do our job even better. So what if we come at the end of the 4th meeting and we give a training? So at the end of that 4th meeting, they came and they delivered a workshop based on the older adult feedback in terms of what they wanted in that meeting, and we promoted it with their recommendations. And so it was really great to kind of jump right in with taking action and shift everybody to now we're going to move these ideas forward. So that's the process. And then briefly to reflect on the questions that you all laid out, which again, I was so taken with them. So nothing definitive here. These aren't my insights, but our collective insights as a group as we worked through it. Let's see. So in terms of getting folks to the table who aren't already there, one idea is to have a dedicated process. So make a new table to some degree that can be more accessible and comfortable for folks to come to. And this isn't to say those voices shouldn't also be part of a larger community-wide process. I think it's an opportunity for a both and approach. But I think there's advantages to dedicated processes with a group where they can really come together and consider their priorities collectively. Recruiting through really diverse partnerships that are deeply engaged with the local community. So having those 3 senior centers that knew different subgroups within the senior community, having Meals on Wheels, having local churches able to get us participants and responses was invaluable. I think having the older adults right there at the beginning of the process, co-designing it and saying, here's how we get folks to come. Here's how we structure it so it's not too long. All those little considerations was essential. And that kind of feeds into all those aspects of accessibility that they recognized needed to be in place. And, as a group, we did our best to put in place that I've kind of tagged there. And then when folks come in, I think there's the question of belonging, how to make it feel like my voice matters. It's meaningful that I came, I'm appreciated, and there's a real space for me to participate. And I think that gets into your second question about authenticity. Again, very humbly, these are my thoughts based on these and what we came up with as a group. But I think early inclusion, I have been involved on participatory projects where the participants are brought in at the tail end after the experts come up with the recommended solutions, and the participants help think through how do we get people to do it. but having them there to define the goals and the process, I think, was really helpful, and real agency in that. So when the older adult said, here's where we should have it, here's how it should be, here's what we should be moving towards, that's what it became. I also think connecting the issue to the participants' day-to-day concerns. So right off the bat, it focused on their own lived experience and what was meaningful for them about the topic we were exploring. I think honoring their strengths and assets that they were bringing, again, not just going with a deficit-based approach, but recognizing all that they could bring. I think an iterative process was helpful. So climate change adaptation planning is fairly complex, I think. But we started with their lived experience of how climate change impacts them now. They considered future impacts. They, through the survey, were able to prioritize what to address, then developing goals and strategies, and then prioritizing those. And these are really detailed and impactful strategies with co-benefits and synergies. I mean, well done. And they owned it every step of the way and built it as they went. So I think that was helpful. And then we also really sought and tried to maintain a diversity of perspectives. So if there were, we looked for kind of the biggest priority items that folks, that the older adult community as a whole brought to the fore. But if there were subgroups within the older adult community that had specific, perhaps more niche concerns, we made sure that those got preserved as the project went forward and were taken up, because you can anticipate that those might be the most vulnerable subgroups within the older adult community, right? If they have some specific concern that isn't more broadly shared. So we did our best to attend to those. Okay, last slide here. In terms of shifting to action, I think having older adults as leaders in the process was essential, that they were the champions of it and moving it forward. I think having all these partner organizations was very helpful because it increased understanding. Both they learned from the older adults by being engaged in the process of older adult concerns and needs and priorities. The older adults who are participating learned from these partner organizations about projects that maybe were going on that they weren't aware of. The organizations learned from each other and kind of built up networks. So in particular, the Office of Emergency Management and the Department on Aging, by the end of this, were on a first name basis and were planning how they could collaborate more closely. I think that in and of itself was probably worth it. And all those partners became champions that could take up a certain aspect of the project. They felt like they had some buy-in and ownership and responsibility to keep it moving forward. Along with that, being intentional about producing information that's useful to the community and the partner organization. So those initial planning meetings about what would be useful that comes out of this for you, knowing that going in, and then helping collaboratively to have that be part of the output. Connected to that, the ideas that got the most traction initially were ones that built on existing initiatives. So rather than trying to create something out of whole cloth, the Office of Emergency Management and Homeland Security was already doing trainings, but they didn't have that direct voice from the seniors about here's what would be most helpful. Here's how you get older adults to come. And so those ways in which we could take something that was already out there and help raise awareness or help better target it or help optimize it to benefit older adults. Those are the ones that were able to get out the door because people were already working on them and there was already money allocated and it was already moving. It just helped them do it better. And I think that last piece about generating initial actions helped shift everybody's mindset to, all right, we have this great plan, but we're not going to just put it on a shelf. We're going to keep moving it forward like we just did. And doesn't it feel so good to take these steps and accomplish something? So those are, a couple initial thoughts on those questions. Thanks everybody for taking the time to listen. Would be delighted to answer any questions that might come up and hear your experiences, your thoughts, other ideas.
Jason, thank you so much. It was a wonderful presentation. I really appreciated it. I think it's David, are you going to be facilitating this part? I think that's right.
Hey, sure. I'm happy to chit chat. I'd also just sort of like to listen first and see, if there's any comments that people would like to share as a group. Solange?
Yeah, thank you. I just have a question around maybe the best strategy or approach for early inclusion. Since there is a general argument, as I shared in the chat, currently doing research on community engagement in climate adaptation plans. It's part of my, it's academic research, but it's something that I hope to take to my future work. That's why I'm interested in this, especially the community-based research. So I'm wondering, because some people have argument about the long process and different resources that it might take to do early inclusion, and they would rather choose to bring recommendations in order to maybe make the process faster, or I don't know, an argument would be that it makes the process easier and you are kind of somehow have suggestions instead of waiting suggestions from the communities. So I don't know like how your experience have been, but also another connected question is that community means different things in different places. You may be working with, older people may mean retired, maybe professionals. In other communities, it may be, defined differently. So also in terms of different aspects that are connected to communities you are working with, I don't know if you have some insights. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for those questions. I'm excited to hear other people's thoughts on them as well. In terms of the question of early inclusion, so the whole project took, I think, about a year. And so the initial 4 months were those preliminary planning meetings before we had our first larger, fully kind of open to the public meeting, and having the Bridgeport Department on Aging as the kind of primary organizer and liaison with the older adult community was essential toward letting it move that fast, as slow as it was. And then it took us a year of doing or it took us another 8 months to work through those 4 meetings and conduct the survey. So it was a slow process. I do think we were able, the pieces that were set was, it was a focus on climate change, vulnerability, and adaptation going in. But that was about it. And the very first conversation was, is this something that is of interest to you all and to the community, or else let's not do it. So once it was like, yeah, this is valuable, this is something we've been thinking about, let's move forward with it. Everything else had opportunity to be shifted and to have input. I think we needed that breathing room and space so that we could have a workshop, we could kind of collect our thoughts from it and come back and let people weigh in on it again, and to really keep everybody up to speed and make sure we were sharing information out. In terms of it, I just want to make one plug for why I think it's worth it. Because the older adults were coming up with those recommendations that they did, there are such great co-benefits for quality of life for the older adult community in Bridgeport in general that I don't think would have been there in an expert-driven approach where we just took best practices for heat adaptation and designed interventions. And I've seen a lot of projects like that, and it's not to knock them, and sometimes you don't have the time to build it out, and there's value in you kind of taking those off-the-shelf recommendations and just bringing them in. I think there's a lot of value in those too. But I think when there's time, when there's interest, really engaging the community can get those kind of more impactful benefits in there. So again, I think it's a both and. And then just quickly, in terms of community, yeah, I think what was most helpful is having the older adult participants and the Department on Aging help illuminate the landscape of different ways in which the older adult community existed in Bridgeport. I think it was helpful that the Department on Aging was a group that was supporting older adult, like not the most privileged older adults in Bridgeport, right? They were hitting a diverse representation of older adults, including ones who didn't have as many resources as some others might. So they were a helpful organizing group in the community that could reach out, and then the older adults themselves too. Yeah, those are initial thoughts, but
I want to put a pin in that 8-month number, but Pavali's had her hand raised and then Nanura. So maybe we'll take those questions, but I do want to revisit that time span before we leave. Pavali?
Sure. Thanks, David. And I actually just had a comment, and maybe there's a question there, but we'll find out. I was wondering if you looked at the work of an organization called Ibasho, and Dr. Emmy Kyota's work. She is a gerontologist and works a lot with older adult population, both internationally, but also in the U.S. And she's basically been kind of talking about the value of having elders kind of share their wisdom and lived experience as a way of not only becoming sort of a more active participant in sort of their own preserving their own kind of lifestyle and independence, but also helping communities who are facing climate adaptation challenges to, prepare better based on sort of, their wisdom of seeing these events happen before and basically putting that to use. I have to say, Ibasho as a model has not been that successful. It started in the US. It started in Japan, and then it took pretty much a stronghold in places like Philippines and Nepal. But Dr. Kyota's attempt to kind of have that take sort of root in the US has been less successful. And I think partly the reason is because, institutional adult or elder care is so strong in the US context that it's been harder to kind of move that model to a different one. And also, I suppose, to your point of not having experts tell people what they should do, but kind of relying on older adults to inform their own sort of future, as well as help their communities come up with an adaptation plan. And I was wondering if that is something that you have heard of or have looked into in terms of different ways of involving older adults. Just a comment.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I love that approach. I'm not familiar with it, and I'm going to look into it. My background is not in gerontology to any degree. I was involved in participation in climate adaptation, and then kind of through the back door ended up working with older adults. So it was definitely a learning curve for me as I went through the process. And so this is, sounds like a wonderful approach. We did, in terms of looking at the older adult community's strengths and assets and strategies for dealing with climate stressors, we did explicitly kind of build into that the recognition of all the change that they have successfully navigated in their lives and the wisdom that they've accumulated, and how can we bring that as part of this, right? That's a real gift that they have to offer. So in a small degree, we're hoping to do something along the same lines, but I think really focusing in on that sounds brilliant.
Yeah, I only wanted to kind of put that out there as a resource for a different kind of model that's been looked at.
Mhm.
Obviously, I wasn't at all hinting at you having to kind of go deep in terms of the expertise in gerontologists, but just consider, one other way to raise the profile of involving elders in community decision making around climate resilience.
That's great. That's great.
Yeah, and I think we celebrate that your expertise and the ability to achieve a transformational change. And I'd love to hear what Honora has to say about the next subject.
Hi, Honora Pierce. I'm in Louisiana, and of course, we dealt with a lot of issues related to climate change already here, and our elderly folks are the most vulnerable to some of the adaptations as well, the maladaptations, such as raising homes, and they have problems with getting up into those homes. But I'm curious, how you approach the subject in the sense of climate change, especially for those folks that are in denial about climate change. And also, as a second part of it is, did you see a difference in what suggestions or concerns were there for themselves versus what they were suggesting for future generations, such as your grandchildren?
Yeah, I'm just making a note. Thank you for those questions. So I'd be curious to hear folks' opinions about this in terms of the climate change politicization. But we, in the initial materials, inviting folks to come and framing it, we talked about extreme weather. And so we talked about the impact of extreme weather on older adults. We didn't foreground climate change in that. In the first time we got together, I gave a really quick presentation on historical trends. So from 1940s to present for our three main stressors. And then we talked about lived experience of those in their lives now. In the second meeting, we did extend those trend lines, and it's not a big shift to say, let's look at the past 60 years and let's look at the next 50 or 100, right? A lot of those trend lines are consistent. And so that's when climate change as an idea came in. We didn't even, turn on a big bright light that said, now we're talking about climate change. We just extended the trend lines in terms of extreme heat. And so we never really foregrounded the idea of climate change in this work. We foregrounded it as we're protecting older adults from extreme weather, and that involves looking at projected trends in extreme weather. And so nobody turned out and walked out of the room when we started looking at projected trends and said, oh, this is a climate change thing, I'm out. I think they had enough buy-in, and I think, we it's not that I would never say the word climate change, or nobody would ever say the word climate change, right? That's clearly what we were doing, but it just wasn't the prominent face of it. So I think there's some value in that, and there's probably does some disservice as well. I'd be curious for folks' thoughts. And the second half of it was, future generations. It's such an interesting question. This might be a factor of making it about extreme weather in terms of the most first foot forward, and the way some of the material, the way it evolved and got framed. But that aspect of concern over future generations wasn't as central a piece. Yeah. So I think that would be really interesting to consider bringing in more explicitly.
And I want to also mention that that's how we do it in the private sector, where when you find a politicized environment about climate change, you shift the discussion to disaster risk reduction and focusing on the problem at hand that's obvious and apparent. The question I would like to ask, and I do want to have other people chime in, and I'm not trying to ask and answer here, but I might do it by accident, which is one of the ideas of this series of questions, or this series of engagements, was how can we do it better, right? And when I hear you say it took 8 months to do it right, I'm like, wow, in the private sector, you just blew my budget, right? So there's two possible options and others that I'd like to expound upon as a group. One is that we make projects bigger and longer, and that we get a general consensus that in order to do stuff better, it costs more time and more money. And that would allow for better incorporation of best-in-class practices like the ones you're mentioning. The other would be, and this is, I think, the one I lean towards, would be a what I call a more successful handoff of the work done successfully to date. I think there's a lot of other options in there, but I would love to get to a point where we don't just say like the question is how can we do it better. I'd love to answer that question. Do you have a preference on those two options, or do you have any other ideas on how we could add the value of an 8-month study or a robust practice like community-based participatory research to improve planning, design, and construction, or other sort of investments?
I can say briefly, one thought that comes to mind is I think you can do networking among identifying the relevant support organizations. I think in a 1 or 2 day workshop, you can help them map out where they're having an impact, what their gaps are, where there's synergies. I think you can have an effective planning process that could let them collaborate more effectively. I think you can have a 1 or 2 day workshop that is participatory and generates a lot of insights with a community. I think the question I'll put back to the group that I'm wondering about, is it the time for relationship building and iterative understanding and kind of accumulation of insight over time, how to shrink that or how to punctuate that as much as possible. So coming back, I guess I'm wondering, is there a way, so acknowledging all these groups are out there doing great work and there's engaged communities and that they're going to be the ones continuing it, how to avoid parachuting in and parachuting out, but to make as useful a contribution in a short amount of time, right? I mean, it's the question you're asking. I'm just getting my head around it. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'd love to hear from everybody. My last comment will be is I would love to answer the question. Let's all think about it as a group and say, like, how can we create a 2-day planning process that leverages community effort successfully? How can we avoid that kind of pick it up and put it down and all the inefficiencies that it creates? So yeah, I think the research question persists for this team and others across industry, and I'd love to kind of begin to consolidate over the next year some of the different ideas that we have on how do we do it better, because we already know how do we do it better in practice, because we already know how to do it better in pilot in theory. Eliza?
Yeah, thank you, Jason, for your talk and for walking us through those case studies. I was just wondering if you could expand more on the language and like specific word choices and how you formed questions in your conversations with the older population specifically, and if you had challenges with communicating and with languages with them.
Yeah, thank you. So I think as it got more concrete, just past the initial, let's focus on climate stressors, the questions were co-generated by primarily the older adult participants and the partners. What I tried to do was share a adaptation planning process of these are the steps we can go through in terms of an initial assessment of vulnerabilities, looking at climate projections, looking at adaptation goals. So here's the steps, but how do we frame those first engagements around assessing vulnerabilities? Came out of the group. So they helped, I think, frame it in a way that would resonate to the older adult community because they were part of it. So that was really helpful, if that makes sense. It did help. The Department on Aging's engagement in this was so valuable. So when we'd have a big workshop, I remember the first workshop specifically, a number of participants came and were thinking that it was going to be a presentation and then they'd have lunch and they'd be done. Because what was explained to me afterwards that I didn't understand, and luckily the Department of Aging and other folks did, is that typically folks come in and give a presentation at the senior center, they share some information, and that's it, and they leave. So it wasn't the typical approach of a really interactive kind of, let's sit around the table and have a discussion kind of approach. So having folks from the Department of Aging who could go table to table, sit down with folks and participate and support those conversations was really helpful. So that if someone was taking more time to think through a certain question or trying to figure out what was being asked of, there was enough individual support to go around and keep everybody engaged, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you.
And there's a question in the chat I just want to touch on because it's so exciting, about a multi-benefit strategy that came for participants. So in the Hartford case study, they had these CROW groups, Community Resilience Organization of Hartford. So it was a combination of the fire department, emergency management, police, a couple different other organizations. And they were trying to boost strategies to enhance resilience as well. And so one of the things the older adults thought was that these CROW groups could convene neighborhood block parties in areas throughout the city, during pleasant weather, where neighbors could come together and get to know each other and make friends and develop a strategy as well for if there's bad weather, who's checking on who, how are we going to make sure everybody's okay. And it's just such a sweet and impactful strategy because it's just building community in and of itself, right? Barring any unpleasant weather, how great to knit that community and build those relationships and help neighbors get to know each other. And then if needed, we have strategies, we have sympathetic relationships already in place. And so there's a number of steps like that I think came out of the fact that they were seeing the priorities of this through multiple lenses and through their own lived experience.
And I love that. And I think that there's something to be said about the fact that when you have a one-directional meeting where there's just a presentation, the real learning happens around the table with the donuts on it, right? And there's nothing really quite as good as breaking bread to really understand what people know from their lived experience through conversation. Melanie, I know I'd like you to go next, and Jackie, maybe you could wrap up the questions.
Thanks, David. I wanted to comment on, I think it was you who raised this question of how when collaborating between different community organizations and supporting a target audience or target clientele, how to avoid, I think the word that Jason used was parachuting, which in other fields might be called showing face, or it's telling me I need to put my hand down, or even it might be analogous to, some kinds of white saviorism in development studies, which is my background in international relations. And though I'm a new graduate, I have had the opportunity to study with members of the civil service or diplomatic service or whatnot at the UN and such. And this is actually something that I'm experiencing right now, because I'm looking for a job. I am doing a lot of networking and recently met someone who's doing, civil society organizing for waste management and educating young people to prevent and better deal with waste in very rural, very poor infrastructure region of Mali. The question of how do I support from here virtually, knowing that I don't have money. I just have me. And the answers that I've been getting is that it's very uncommon to even have someone approach them. But listening and asking the questions is already an accomplishment as someone who's, or it's already a big difference, apparently, even inside of my field. So that was a supportive experience that I had today that was really illuminating. And the other piece that I've been made aware of also recently is that maintaining visibility of my networks and my resources, even just like keeping a well-organized Evernote and Google Drive, is one of the best ways that I can support peers. And I know that's not exactly an answer to your question, but I'm bringing you both challenges and reflections. So I hope that I've added something to the conversation here.
And I think that gets to the heart of the matter, which was on the last call. Someone mentioned the question, how we suggested be anti-racist in your processes, right? And someone asked, how do you be anti-racist? Right? And those are the questions that can only be answered when you're the boots on the ground engaging people one-on-one, right? It's an action, it's an act, it's a call, it's a purpose. And it's something worth investing in, right? It's worth the 8 months. And I made a joke very early with my co-presenter, which is the 2 day session that Jason mentioned. In order to do it right, it costs quite a bit of money, and it doesn't account for all of the sweat equity that you put into trust building and asking questions and having conversations and relationship building. So it's really, we have to re-identify how do we pay for the value that's being created by a large constituency that should be all oriented in the same direction. And how can we allow those parachuting in activities, right? Build me a community center. How can we have them both inherit the benefit from the hard work and value already done, contribute to that process, and then carry it on going forward? And if it's a process of handing the baton on and off, how do we do that better? And if it's not a process of handing off a baton, how do we better incorporate and work together as a unified body? Jason or Jackie, can you find that any kind of closing Q&A observations? Nicole as well.
Well, I'll toss in one quick thought, David, on that is the kind of sustained relationships so that the baton back and forth or holding it together can happen. You know, I think academia has certain things to offer, isn't under quite the temporal and financial pressures to some degree that the private sector is. I think there are, you know, the municipal state agencies that are involved. I think there's the private sector. And I think there's community being able to be defined in all these different ways. And so in systems thinking, I'm increasingly convinced it's the relationship of the parts of the system that are the most important thing. And so how can we have those linkages and relationships in an ongoing way and emphasize certain actors in the system at certain points where they can have an impact. So everybody's not flat out all the time, but we're efficiently collaborating and supporting those who are often most marginalized, right? If we can center those voices and concerns and perspectives in a ring of well-engaged, prolonged relationships, I think there's something there that eases the burden for everybody, maybe.
Nicole, you have any last words? Okay, well, first of all, I just want to thank Jason so much for being with us and so many great questions and comments in our room. And we didn't even need to do breakout rooms. It was perfect. So that was great. Here's what I heard as we're kind of wrapping things up and finishing. I love the idea of making a new table, right? we always are talking about who's in the table or can we get more people around the table. But sometimes that table doesn't suit the purpose of reaching new groups or including new people or different people or marginalized people. So I love that. I love the idea of co-design, centering the participants' lived experiences, and then optimizing existing initiatives. As you're talking about systems thinking, I feel like the organizations I work the most with, which are cities, counties, and school districts, I see them launching these initiatives and doing these listening things department by department instead of trying to unify and bring together pieces of the community and people in the community to give them feedback on lots of things. So there's all these separate relationship building things going on, which are very labor intensive and take 8 months or a year or whatever. And so I'm trying to get them to think more in a systematic way to build these relationships and have these advisory groups, or whatever you want to call them, affinity groups, to help give them better feedback and input. And then the last thing I'll say as a researcher is we need to do a better job of rapid cycle research. Right? David says it costs too much, and oftentimes when we get going on some of these things, it's 8 months or 12 months, and the problem needed to be solved 6 months ago. So I'm participating in a study right now where we're talking to city managers and chief communication officers, and we're already sharing the stuff we're learning. We've been interviewing people for 2 months, and we'll write it up in 2024 as a freaking journal article. But I'm already talking about it with groups, and I'll be talking about it next week. And so I think we academics have got to, and anybody doing research need to get better at rapid cycle research. It's okay to share things ahead of time. It's okay to share some preliminary findings and get them out into the community. So that's my 2 cents worth. And we just really thank you all for being here. Again, we'll tackle this topic in August with another great session as part of a trio of sessions this summer about this topic. And then we'll have some other great programming for you in the fall. And again, tell your friends, and we'd love to see you back again in August or later in the fall. So take care, everybody. Stay cool. I'm in Texas. It's 105 already here. So yeah, we'll be back to heat management soon. We'll talk about that some more. So take good care, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. You're so kind. Appreciate it. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye.
Jason.